Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us as we discuss 6 ways providers can transform their organizations with CRM. My name is Katie Wu, and I lead our go-to-market efforts for Salesforce Health Cloud, and I'll be your moderator today. I'm excited to be joined by Joshua Newman, Chief Medical Officer at Salesforce, and John Lanka, CIO at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. Before we begin, I wanted to cover a couple of logistics. We encourage you to submit questions at any time throughout the presentation in the Enter a Question for Staff section. We will answer as many questions as we can at the end of this presentation. Additionally, in about a week following the webinar, we'll send you a copy of the presentation to the email you used to register. With that, I'd like to introduce Joshua Newman.
Thank you very much, Katie, and thanks everyone for joining. Today we're going to talk about CRM and healthcare and all the ways that we can help transform organizations together. Before we start, I'd like to just mention that as a publicly traded company, Salesforce would like to remind you to make decisions on investment and purchasing based on what we sell today. Even though we're not going to have very many forward-looking statements today, it's an important note. And with that, let's begin. So the learning objectives for today are to learn about customer relationship management, what it really means, and how it can impact customer journeys, patient journeys, and how it can support better outcomes. We're going to talk today about this new category in healthcare, something that is gaining in momentum, and how it can be valuable and how it has been valuable to some of the key participants in the landscape. And rather than hide this 6 ways in the middle of the presentation, which is something that I've always avoided and been irritated by when people sort of hide the treasure, we sort of wanted to give this to you up front to share some of the ways that organizations are transforming with CRM. And this is sort of a preview of the different kinds of things that CRM encompasses and the different ways that healthcare organizations have been using this to take care of patients. Many of these are familiar to you, whether inside of healthcare or outside of healthcare, and we're going to spend a lot more time going into depth. Important to mention that on the top, you see attract, serve, and engage. These are the 3 sort of temporal moments in the experience of a patient or any customer for that matter as they engage with an organization. We're going to talk a bunch about how those work and what they really mean. So first, thank you. Thank you for taking time on your Tuesday morning to spend time with us and talk a little bit about CRM. Thank you for the work you do in healthcare, and for every single person on this webinar. You can take special pride in the notion that you are at the forefront of where healthcare is going. CRM is not something that a lot of people have spent time on over the past decades. Obviously, people have been spending much more time on electronic medical records and digitizing clinical care. Now CRM seems to be in the ascendance, and for those folks that are learning about it, they have an extra special advantage. So thank you for taking the time to learn about it and to invest in it. So what gives us the right to talk about CRM? Well, for those of you that don't know, Salesforce is the 4th largest software company in the world. And we've been recognized by a number of different organizations in ways that we're proud of. On the right side of this slide, you see some of the effects of the work that we do. But most important to me is the Innovator of the Decade number on the left side. And what it really says is that we're constantly in the mode of changing, growing, and adapting to the changes that we see in the marketplace. Because of our cloud computing platform, because we're able to deliver these applications in a modern way, we're able to change. And a lot of this presentation stems from, and a lot of our success in healthcare stems from, our ability to change and adapt to what we see the market requiring. And what market is that we're looking at? Well, we have a lot of experience in healthcare where many people might not see it. We've learned a lot from all 4 segments of healthcare, and indeed even from some segments that you might not consider typically healthcare, including retail and even the public sector space. We started off selling to pharmaceutical and med device companies, and we've sold since to payers and providers. And now not only do these organizations use Salesforce for the standard sales roles of CRM, which many people may know about, but also for the patient relationship aspect of them, not to mention the provider and sort of partner relationship aspect also. So at this point in time, we have examples in every one of these segments and some of the largest companies, largest healthcare companies in the world that are using Salesforce for CRM, again, not just to sell, but also to foster the relationships that result in better care and better outcomes. And so what is CRM? Let's talk about how CRM has changed over time. Back when we started our company, Salesforce brought CRM to the cloud, and CRM at that point was pretty easy. It was basically a contact application for sales. And then over time, people said they wanted to take care of their customers and provide better customer service. And then they said they wanted to do marketing and take care of their customers and acquire new customers with marketing. And then they realized they had to start delivering all of this information via mobile device and all kinds of other connected devices, and even all the way till now when we're adding systems of intelligence and AI to the platform. And so what we see is that the definition of CRM has really grown, and it's mirrored in a lot of ways the battlefield on which organizations have been fighting for success. It started off as product, that it was enough just to have a good product, and then it moved to customer service. And now it seems like the entire customer journey is something that is relevant and important for the success of organizations. And nowhere is this more evident than in healthcare. The lessons that we get from healthcare really come from the various companies and other industries that we relate to every single day. And I would wager that virtually everyone on this call has experience with one or maybe several of these companies that you see on the screen. And obviously we sort of love these companies because they take care of us, they serve us very well, they make our lives convenient and allow us to spend time with the other things that we love in life. But what's interesting is that the organizations themselves have a different mindset. The organizations themselves have become innovation engines and machines to direct themselves towards what their customers want. And they've used technology to do that, and they've used a culture of constant change and constant providing of expectations and good experiences to their customers. So what happens when this kind of motif and these kinds of patterns hit healthcare? Well, we see a very different kind of world despite people's interest in it. And this slide really just shows that some of the most prominent organizations in healthcare agree that taking care of the customer, developing connections, focusing on individuals is of importance and utility in healthcare. But again, healthcare really doesn't have the same kinds of benefits or smoothness as some of the other industries. What we see is a variety of different places where people get their care. We see constant challenges and obstacles being thrown up between patients and the different individuals or organizations that they want to be a part of, not to mention the kinds of bare bones logistical challenges, whether it's transportation or payment or simply understanding that patients fail to have, that results in challenges and difficulties. And you might even say that it results in higher costs, it results in inefficiencies, and sometimes lower morale, not just for the patients, but also for caregivers. So what does it look like to change this map from the complexity and the pain in the middle to something better? Well, as a conceptual tool, we'd like to offer the idea of a journey. This is the first step in achieving successful customer relationship management. It's understanding and seeing the experience of a patient from the perspective of a single journey. Now remember, there are many different directions that journeys go, but it's important to realize the elements that we see on this page here. So the first is the blue boxes. For the history of healthcare, most of us who've been training in medicine have focused on what we can do inside of these boxes because we get paid for those, and indeed our institutions have been set up to deliver mammograms and surgeries and births, for example. But what turns out to be very interesting these days is that the space between those boxes, the space between the high cost, high value medical interventions really happens in between, in those little dots, whether it's the prep before a surgery or the care afterwards that makes a surgery successful and reduces the likelihood of adverse events, or the opportunity to obviate some of these altogether by providing better health, wellness, and sometimes just life support. So what we see here on the page is the first example of the attract, serve, and engage rubric. And the idea is that at different points in the journey, An organization has a chance to build a relationship with a patient, to provide the service that makes them feel better, as well as make the healthcare interventions more successful, and engage them in an ongoing way, even after care, so that not only prevention and other kinds of lower acuity relationship actions can take place, but also in case something does happen, a relationship has been established, loyalty has been established, and knowledge of each other can make whatever intervention is necessary more successful. And so the way that organizations find themselves doing this kind of work is by picking specific use cases of CRM and expanding on them. We talked about the attract, serve, and engage, but these 6 bubbles depict 6 of the more common ways that we see healthcare organizations of all kinds investing in technologies and capabilities that allow them to connect with their patients or customers. So the first 2 apply to the acquisition phase. How do you acquire patients either through patient marketing or physician referrals? This is obviously important, but it's something that's relatively new in healthcare. For as long as I can remember, every other company that I ever engaged with would reach out, advertise, and try and attract folks. But in healthcare, we sort of hadn't done that until recently. And maybe by virtue of the competition, maybe by virtue of the importance of attracting patients to value-based organizations, this patient marketing piece and the physician referral piece is crucial. And this is a capability that healthcare systems are investing in a great deal and using this as the foundation of their customer relationship management strategy. The second 2 bubbles depict the kinds of outward bound interventions and actions that healthcare organizations do towards patients. So whether it's a contact center that can both call and receive calls and communications from patients, or the home health work that's projecting the healthcare that people are giving to people at home. These are both capabilities that really are somewhat new in healthcare. Even though contact centers sort of have been around for a long time, they're attaining new importance, and they have new roles that are expanding into the clinical realm more and more. As people get care at home and people are remote and people are using mobile devices everywhere, these kinds of functions both take care of people when they're sick and also prevent their illness in the first place. And then the third group, the third couplet of bubbles here, are around care team collaboration and patient engagement. And these 2 really refer to the kind of ongoing relationships and the ongoing organization that are important for healthcare providers to do. There was once upon a time when you could take care of patients as an organization by yourselves in your hospital with just a few doctors. In fact, when I trained in family medicine, we were more or less taught that we could do it ourselves. It turns out now that a whole ecosystem of partners, both medical and non-medical, doctors and nurses and physical therapists and dietitians and home health aides are important to the care of a patient, but also transportation and rent assistance and food assistance and educational assistance. And then indeed, the patients are really the most important element in this whole equation. Now with mobile devices and with the kinds of proliferation of all kinds of different systems and applications and technologies out there, a whole range of different services can be brought to the patient wherever they are through engagement technologies. So let's talk about these in some more detail. At this point, it's really my pleasure to invite a good colleague, good friend and colleague to join me. It's great to welcome John Halamka. Hi, John. Say hi, please.
Well, happy to be here. And of course, I live this dream every day with my 22,000 employees, my 2 million patients, and 7 petabytes of data in EHRs. It's really hard for 3,000 doctors to navigate 7 petabytes.
We're going to ask you much more about this. And it's pretty funny to introduce you on a webinar. I'm used to introducing you on stage, and I don't hear the applause, but I'm sure it's out there.
Oh, thank you.
So let's begin by talking about some of the acquisition actions, patient marketing and physician referrals. I'm going to tell you a little story about a customer that we have, and then we can talk a little bit about what this might mean. As many of you may have seen in a recent press release, Aurora Healthcare is a relatively large system out in the Illinois and Wisconsin area, And they're using Salesforce. They're using the acquisition and marketing function for Salesforce in a very interesting way. They have Epic as their EMR, as their institutional EMR, and they found that they had disappointing use of their portal, of their MyChart system. And so Salesforce Marketing Cloud was used to drive personalized communications to these people, to give them the incentive, the motivation, or the awareness to log in, to download the app and log in and start not only looking at their health information, but also engaging with their care team. And so they found an increase in open rates and downloads. These are standard metrics that we would see with many marketing campaigns. And to me, what's interesting is that Salesforce was used in conjunction with Epic as the marketing tool that would increase adoption. And I think in this small vignette, you see the very clear demarcation of functions. What is the EMR good for? Let's say presenting medical information or laboratory information and whatnot. And the Salesforce marketing side of this is to drive the behavior and the relationship. So it's sort of interesting. So John, let me ask you, can you tell us a few of the ways that you're seeing healthcare organizations looking at marketing these days?
Well, certainly. So Beth Israel Deaconess and a number of institutions in Boston created their current websites about 10 years ago. And they were brochureware. They were encyclopedias. And so I can tell you now that we're actually seeing the web and mobile as the mechanism to engage patients and to ensure we can coordinate their care. All of our websites are totally insufficient for purpose. We've actually looked at such things as abandonment rate. It's 70% or higher that a patient comes, visits the website, does nothing, and leaves. So the patients in so many other industries are used to having tools and technologies that allow them to do the things they come to do, whether that's make an appointment or pay a bill, learn more about a process, help them coordinate a visit, etc. And existent healthcare websites really don't do that. So we're seeing a consumer demand. But on the other hand, we're seeing our providers saying reimbursement now depends on care coordination, quality, and outcomes. And if we aren't with our existing tools doing that very well, we need to improve it because payer reimbursement to our physicians in alternative quality contracts depends upon it. So we're blowing up existent websites. We're creating new mobile experiences, and we're thinking about ways in a value-based purchasing world that we can treat the patients as customers. So it's exactly the kind of thing you described with Aurora.
So what's interesting about that, John, is that these technologies sort of grew at a time when people obviously didn't care enough about this kind of thing to build better websites. And they were satisfied with them for a long time. I remember the websites where I trained, and they were the same way. What's changed? Why all of a sudden the interest in marketing and sort of patient acquisition and experience?
Well, remember, there are only 3 ways to influence a clinician. First, pay them more. Second, give them a better quality of practice life. And third, help them avoid public embarrassment, like failing meaningful use or bad quality scores. So what's happened, the incentives today are different than they used to be when you and I trained. If a doctor is now paid for patient satisfaction, for the fact that total medical expenses are not too high, not too low, they're just right, that outcomes are good, that means the doctor will be embarrassed, paid less, and have a horrible quality of practice life if the tools are insufficient.
That's great. And just the last question that I'll ask about this in the acquisition phase is, we've seen organizations for a long time, and I think the pioneers in this space in healthcare have used marketing because they wanted to reach out and grab and acquire new customers or new patients. So for-profit systems or systems that were facing a lot of competition started using marketing to promote their brand and to reach out to people. That's a pretty straightforward story. And when you look at the competitive landscape, it makes a lot of sense. Can you tell us a little bit about the utility of marketing and patient acquisition in the value-based space?
Sure. So wouldn't it be wonderful if the United States had a healthcare system? Well, it doesn't, right? It has disconnected hospitals and doctors' offices, pharmacies, and labs. So in a value-based purchasing world, we are now held accountable for the patient's continuous medical experience over their life. You need to create almost a virtual healthcare system. And we care about this not only because we can actually then materially impact the quality and the outcome, but also it's really hard to control cost if patients are going off to other institutions where, for example, in Boston, there's very high variation in cost among institutions one block away from each other. If a patient leaves the Beth Israel Deaconess system of care and goes to a competitor, we could see a 25% increase in cost for the same care. So our marketing folks really need to keep the patients happy within the system of care: inpatient, outpatient, urgent care, emergency departments, SNFs, LTPAC, all the rest of the things that we do, by convincing them that our brand means something and that care coordination will happen better if they stay within that system.
That's great. It's great to see that there is now an incentive to build these closer relationships with people and a reward for doing so, which really takes us to the next phase. What do we do when we actually want to take care of patients? What kinds of technologies do we use over and above the electronic medical record to take care of folks? And for that, we'll illustrate it by talking about the contact center and home health services and how they relate. Specifically, we can tell a story of the Easter seals in the Bay Area. So one of the customer stories that we have that really warms my heart more than most is the work that we're doing with Easter seals. So Easter Seals Bay Area takes care of thousands of children in the Bay Area, and they do most of it with autism care. So for those of you that don't know, Easter Seals takes care of children with disabilities, and they've been doing so for a long time. It's a very beautiful organization. So what they do is they take referrals from Kaiser. And for those of you that don't know, Kaiser Permanente is a very prominent payer, provider organization. They take care of a lot of people. They have hospitals, they have clinics, they have an insurance company. And I always thought of them as the organization that did it all. Well, it turns out they don't. They don't take care of children with autism. So they outsource that work and they send referrals to Easter Seals to take care of those patients. And so now what we see is Easter Seals is using the Health Cloud, a Salesforce product that takes care of patients and does sort of patient CRM. And they receive the referral from Kaiser. They go to the patient's homes. They take a cognitive and behavioral assessment using technology. They collaborate with their colleagues to get these patients on standard care plans. They send the information back to their Athena Health EMR to get billed, to make billing happen. And then they send all the information back to Kaiser to complete the loop with those providers who've made the referral. So what you see is a single platform for referrals, for care, for collaboration, mobile apps for doing assessments, also mobile apps for the family, and it's in the hands of thousands of different professionals of different kinds. So in this one use case, we can see home health, we can see mobility, and we can see the kinds of knitting together of various organizations in one place. So as we talk about the service line, let's begin by asking you, John, what do you think is driving people's motivation to extend their functionality beyond the electronic medical record?
Well, and so you know, I have great respect for all of the vendors of electronic health records in America. And I'm certainly not going to criticize any particular electronic health record, but I could say if your goal is not generating a bill or complying with a regulation, but your goal is to coordinate care across a group of people delivering team-based services, the EHRs are all insufficient for purpose. And in fact, sometimes, you know, this is, of course, also not a comment about Salesforce, but I stand on stage and I say, if you had to take 10 people and coordinate an event like a patient care experience, would it be easier in your EHR or Facebook? And 100% of the audience says, oh, well, Facebook, of course. So it illustrates the problem that we designed EHRs, and they were perfect for the era in which they were designed, the 1990s, to do data collection and generate reports for government and payer organizations, but they were never designed to be this team-based groupware for care coordination and closing loops. So if, for example, in this Easter Seals example you highlighted, you wanted to identify a patient, send them for services, make sure they got those services, make sure that the patient felt they had appropriate services, there's really no function in EHR that does that. There are some 11 steps that Harvard institutions have identified as to what it's necessary to create a closed-loop system around team-based care in multiple organizations. So hence you need some third-party products that layer on top of your EHR that provide this functionality.
That's great. Now, this example that we talked about is autism care, and I think everyone understands, has an intuition that autism care is one of those things that is not treated with a drug or a procedure or a study, but it's sort of ongoing, and it requires sort of ongoing intervention and, let's say, relationship, whether it's by the parents or by health professionals. How representative is this kind of use case, in your opinion, John, to the kinds of things where we're really, the kinds of things that are most important in the healthcare landscape today?
Sure. So much of what we're doing in healthcare today is multifactorial. It isn't, as you say, one test or one intervention, because it's about keeping you healthy. There's subjective data. You know, what's your blood pressure? And then there's objective data. What is your blood pressure, or your pulse ox, or these sorts of things. But then there's subjective data, like how do you feel? What are your activities of daily living? What is your mood? So as we increasingly look to the future of these tools, we make an intervention. We get feedback from the patient, subjective and objective. We make another intervention. It is by no means a one and done. It is a continuous process.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate the comment of the kinds of medical interventions or the kinds of medical care that responds well to this kind of thing. You just brought up a very interesting point, which is the subjective experience of this thing. I think we should talk a little bit about what patients feel and what drives their behavior. What can you tell us about the patient experience around all of this? Do they seek this out? Do they make decisions based on how well they can communicate with people that are taking care of them, or how convenient they can get care at home?
So several years ago, the Beth Israel Deaconess Marketing Department surveyed 2,000 patients in Boston and said, if you had an e-enabled physician, defined as the kinds of things we're talking about, you can easily make an appointment, communicate securely, get follow-ups, share data, these kinds of things, would you switch doctors? 19% of patients said they would switch doctors. And this is really an unheard of statistic, because typically if it's something like, there's a doctor who's Dr. Famous who just won a Nobel Prize, would you switch doctors? 2%, 3%. 19% of patients switching to have this kind of functionality is off the charts.
Well, the take-home message that I get from something like that is extremely encouraging to me, which shows that what patients want is what hospitals and all kinds of healthcare organizations are starting to want. And there seems to be some reimbursement and some value for both parties to do these things in a right way. I really love that. The other I think part of this is the home health aspect of this. We talk a lot about home care, and we know that in the United States, people get discharged more quickly than in many other countries. John, can you tell us a little bit about what's driving that behavior and whether you see sort of that trend continuing?
Sure. So again, our challenge is we don't want to give you too little hospital stay or too much hospital stay. We want to give you the right hospital stay. And I think it can be certainly my experience is that hospital length of stay will vary widely based on a lot of social determinants of health, education, communication, and other resources. So some years ago, we did a study with NICU babies and said, Mom, Dad, would you be willing to take this child home? Because, a NICU stay is about $5,000 a day. And they said, well, we're a little unsure. What if something happens? What if I need to consult with someone? So he said, well, how about this? We'll pay $2,000 and give you a tool in the home that gives you 24/7 access to a NICU professional should you have any question or issue. Great. I will take my child home today. We found that you could get actually a 7-day reduction in hospital stay for NICU babies by offering the kinds of technology tools that fostered more rapid, convenient communication. So spend $2,000 to save $35,000. This is the sort of direction we need to go in, which is Hospitals are not a great place for sick people, right? There's infection issues and fall issues. It's hard to sleep. So let's give you the tools so you can thrive in your home, reducing total medical expense, but also improving quality and patient satisfaction.
That's fantastic. It's a great story. And again, the theme keeps coming up that we're pivoting as a healthcare industry towards doing the things that not only are helpful from a medical perspective and a patient experience perspective, but also that have benefits in terms of cost and the finances of healthcare. And it seems like that's really the trifecta that we're looking for. So let's move on to the third domain, which is what happens when people are at home. How do we start taking care of them when they've left the office or they left the hospital, and where we know 99% of the decisions that they make and the things that they do that bear on their health are going to happen? Well, the two use cases that we have here are care team collaboration and patient engagement. And the use case that we have, or the story that we have to tell, is of Mount Sinai. Many of you know Mount Sinai Medical Center, a very large academic health system out of New York. And what they've done is they've decided to start using Salesforce to take care of 350,000 patients in their district population, which is a Medicaid program whose aim is to decrease the cost of taking care of these patients. Now, many of you may know that Medicaid patients tend to be poorer, sicker, they have fewer resources, sometimes lower education and less technology. And so how do you take care of these people with multiple comorbidities who cost a lot of money to take care of, that results obviously in terrible suffering? So what Mount Sinai has done is they've knitted together a community of 350,000 patients, 500 care coordinators on the Mount Sinai staff, 20,000 community health professionals, and 2,000 physicians in and around New York to try and reduce the avoidable hospital admission rate by 25%, which is significant. In a population of 350,000 patients, that savings could run into the tens of millions of dollars. And so what they've done is they've brought everyone together on a single platform. They've included organizations like Meals on Wheels and organizations that provide transportation and financial assistance. And they've done this to try and keep people at home and keep them out of the hospital. As many of us know, the kinds of things that cause these kinds of avoidable hospital admissions sometimes are people not taking their medication. Sometimes it's missing an appointment or not having a follow-up appointment after an admission. And what Mount Sinai is betting on is that they can use CRM, they can use the multiple technologies and the convening powers of technology to bring these kinds of organizations together and the individuals together using mobile technology and other kinds of systems to avoid some significant costs and avoidable morbidity. So the question that I would turn to you, John, to talk about this is, we've talked a lot in healthcare for a while now on avoiding readmissions, especially for things like congestive heart failure and sort of the end stages of diabetes with kidney failure and some other diseases. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience with reaching out to people and trying to keep them healthy and keep them out of the hospital?
Sure. So what we found, again, EHR is great for describing the encounter you have with a healthcare system. The EHR is not so great for watching your progress at home after discharge or after an outpatient stay, deciding where there's now decompensation or variability, and then making an intervention. So we've had to deploy different kinds of tools for that purpose. And an example, when you're discharged from Beth Israel Deaconess for congestive heart failure, we have an application in your home that, with your consent, sends weights from your bathroom scale to us on a daily basis, so we can start looking for, oh, you had a 7-pound weight gain in a weekend. Probably that's going to result in so much fluid retention that you're going to show up in the ER on Monday. Let's, over the weekend, before that happens, double your Lasix dose, take away your salty foods, educate you about lifestyle, etc. And just doing that, we found, reduces readmissions 15%. So think about this. This is not the EHR documenting data about an encounter. It's that interstitial space between encounters that needs a different kind of technology.
That's great. Now, it seems a little odd that a hospital like Beth Israel or even Mount Sinai would put themselves in the business of keeping people out of the hospital. It seems to go against the business model, and it seems to go against a long tradition that started, over 100 years ago about bringing people to the hospital to give them care. Can you discuss a little bit about this kind of, what I would consider this sort of seismic shift in how we're thinking about taking care of people?
Sure. Well, let me give you two examples. So example number one, and it's totally fine for me to share this with you because no one in my family has any privacy. My daughter calls me on a Saturday night at 7, right? Every primary care office or specialty office closed, and says, Dad, I have polyuria, polydipsia, polyphagia. That's not actually what she said. But, as doctors, we're trained if we hear the polys, oh my God, that's new onset diabetes. So what I realize is, okay, she probably needs a glucose checked. Pretty hard to do that over the phone. And some very basic labs, urinalysis, etc. But I don't want to send her to an emergency department because that's going to be high cost. She'll wait forever. And there are going to be people with trauma and stroke and other bad things. So what has Beth Israel done? It's created a different class of care, this urgent care idea, where we're open late and on weekends, where you can get some basic labs done very rapidly at low cost with high quality. And again, value-based purchasing says that's what we want to do. My daughter goes to the urgent care. By the way, you can make appointments on your iPhone. Yes, I'd like to be seen in 15 minutes. Okay. And her labs are totally normal, and it turns out she just has a viral illness, and it's not diabetes. So our CEO is now being asked, how do I reduce unnecessary ER visits, unnecessary admissions? How do I prevent building more capacity and expensive downtown real estate towers staffed by Harvard professors? Because I need to push care to the community into different settings at lower cost if we're going to survive the transformation in reimbursement.
Well, again, a good story for patients and getting convenience. And I also like how your daughter had the same experience that we would all expect from the retail sector, the transportation sector, and that it's coming more and more to healthcare. It can only serve us well. So as we round out the story here, what we see is a number of different use cases. In fact, we have even more than the 6 that we tease you with, because there's essentially a very broad range. There are many different moments in that journey that can begin and can strengthen the relationships between healthcare organizations and patients. Whether it's in the acquisition phase, the one we added here was network management. It's very important for organizations to knit up the different partners that they have, or for post-acute support and case management, which are the 2 that we added to the serve part, or things like patient services that give patients education, reimbursement support, and the other kinds of supports that they need to prepare for healthcare and also to recover from healthcare. That every one of these moments, and maybe countless others, are part of that CRM continuum, and that all of it bears not only on the success of health and the subjective feeling and the relief of disease, but also on the cost. And so as we've talked about the attraction, the service, and the engagement pieces, we really see this in support of the triple aim that we always talk about: improving quality of care, reducing cost, and supporting population health. I hope we've given you some examples, and now it's a really great time to talk about questions and answers. I hope that we've got about 500 and something people registered for the webinar, so we're hoping that there's some great questions, and let me give it back to Katie, who can take us into the Q&A period.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Josh and John. I want to remind everyone that you can continue to submit questions using the Enter a Question for Staff, and we'll try to get through as many questions as we can. So for the first one, could you talk a little bit more about how you would approach the conversation of getting physicians to use another system?
Well, hey, why don't I start with that? Because I'll tell you, as a CIO, providing mission-critical applications to 3,000 docs, they really don't like using a separate application that is outside the workflow of their EHR. So what do? We recognize that a lot of this care coordination stuff is done by care traffic controllers, care managers who are using EHR data. In fact, it might be multiple EHR data sets to coordinate the care of a patient and ensure they get the services they need, close gaps in care, and that sort of thing. It's totally fine for a care manager or care navigator to use a separate application from the EHR. And as I say, it's maybe necessary if there are multiple EHRs involved in the underlying data sets. As well, doctors will participate in all this if there are alerts and reminders and messages and documents that come into their EHR. So where there is a need for a doctor to be engaged, we just make sure and do tight coupling of integration of data inside the EHR.
What I'd love to add to that is the mechanism or the strategy aspect of this. How do we actually roll things like this out? How do health professionals end up using some of these modern technologies, especially when they're not congruent with their training? The EMRs did things that we were all taught to do in medical school and what nurses are trained to do in nursing school. Write notes on people, write orders, execute orders, and so on. But the CRM space, whether it's in the acquisition, the attraction, or the service, or the home care, is not something that we're all trained on. So how do we start rolling these technologies out in ways that get them used? Well, I think you raised a good point, John, that it's not only about doctors, and that's one benefit, but the other piece is that we've seen is really interesting, and it's predicated on the notion that doctors are people too. We're consumers, that we shop and we travel and we use our phones as much or more than anyone. And then we get to healthcare and we don't have those same tools. And so what we've seen is there are some organizations that treat their employees, that treat their staff and their partners, much less their patients, like consumers. So if you were a startup and you were in Silicon Valley and your job was to try and get people to use your app or your system of some sort, you would build a minimum viable product, a so-called MVP. You would have it solve an important pain point in your customer base, and you would make them love it. And then you would increase it, you would augment it. You would use cloud-based systems, and you would rapidly iterate, and you would basically grow in the way that your customers wanted you to grow, and you would respond to their needs. And over time, your application would get more and more robust. That's one of the methods that we're seeing that gets people to use some of these modern technologies. They might start small and they might start modestly, and they get people to use it, and over time it grows and becomes much more functional.
And Josh, I'll just tell you that solution works so well. I mean, when we rolled out Open Notes 5 years ago, people said, "Oh, you're sharing notes with patients? Oh, that's scary. And they're going to call, and it's going to suddenly disrupt my workflow." And, today it's a condition of practice, and no one can imagine practicing without bidirectional communication with their patients.
Great. That's great.
So let's think about it the other way around. How can physicians approach their system leadership to address some of these potential ideas that we talked about in the webinar today?
At least at Beth Israel Deaconess, and I'm sure this is true at many other organizations, all of our IT strategy is bottom up. I have never found that being a CIO gives me any authority over anything. I have accountability, but not authority. And so we have 30 people on our governance committee that come from all the disciplines across the organization. And they say, here is a pain point that I have. Here is a problem I need to solve. Or here's a reimbursement challenge I'm encountering. So I would hope you could use the governance committees that you have to bubble these issues up and then build a sense of urgency.
That's helpful. I think I'd also add, in the same way that we talked about the strategy of rolling things out, we could add, the strategy of this kind of thing, which is, look, we'd love a top-down implementation. We'd love it if hospitals had, great big budgets to transform their organizations in the ways that they seem to invest in transforming their organizations to digital with EMRs. But we don't see that happening very much. I think there's a paucity of capital and energy and expertise for some of these things, and it's a little bit daunting because, again, this takes away from some of the core missions and histories of hospital systems. And so the ways that we've seen organizations pull this off is they pick something that they know how to do it, or they already have budget for it, or they start with something that's known. I'll give you an example. We talked about the contact center earlier, and we all have examples of the contact center being, the nidus around which patients get care at home and they have questions that get answered, and there's all kinds of bidirectional interaction. One of the reasons why that's the case is because hospitals have had contact centers for a long time. They've realized they've needed contact centers, and it's a lot easier to tell a hospital system or to tell your leadership, let's take our contact center, let's put it on a modern technology platform so that we can increasingly add healthcare support, at-home care, device data, whatever you need to sort of add, rather than trying to present to them some radical transformation at the outset. So beginning with the marketing budget and the marketing functions that already exist, or beginning with the communications and contact centers that already is necessary, or beginning with the collaboration for which your organization already has budget and political support, we've seen is the best way to help transform organizations. Because, and we could have said this at the thank you at the beginning, we're all sort of in the midst of this radical transformation in healthcare, and it's not the kind of thing that I think is best served by a radical revolution. It seems like slower iteration is the way it's going to have to happen, and building on success and building on current priorities seems to be a way that people have found it.
And what's interesting, Josh, is that a hospital like mine with 450 sites of care has many customers, right? The patients are customers, the physicians are customers, the researchers are customers. And so you're exactly right that what I'm saying is that so many problems need to be solved that I'm getting, people raising their hands and say, I need CRM for this. And it starts small. It is not, and I didn't mean to imply that we go through a governance committee and say, oh, can we find $5 million in new capital to build this giant solution? No, it starts organically and builds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Perfect. And we have time for one more question. And how would you suggest, or what advice do you have to meeting these goals with low staffing?
Okay, well, I'm going to have a very controversial answer for this, Josh, which is today, Beth Israel Deaconess has 3 data centers, and I expect that within 3 years we'll have 0 data centers. Why? Because we are moving from a provisioning software model with locally hosted and licensed software to procuring services from cloud-hosted providers. And so what we actually see is existent staff are deployed to do more productive things. So it's literally changing the kinds of services that the IT department delivers and redeploying existent budgets and staff in a more effective way.
I like this kind of 1-2 that we've been doing today, John, because again, I'm going to talk about some of the tactics that we've been seeing for this. I think your point about how this is done, and obviously the whole history of technology and productivity tells a story that you can do much more with fewer people than ever before. And all of this technology and all of this investment by organizations, not only in healthcare, but outside of healthcare, is really predicated on the increased productivity that you can get from even a small staff for this kind of thing. But that doesn't automatically help us because healthcare is sort of different. And so what we've been seeing, again, is a sort of a start small mentality. Doctors and colleagues, and I'd even sort of claim, I'd admit to some of this myself, we're really fond of building grand plans. And there are emotional reasons for it, and there's some success reasons for it too, but it's really hard to develop a huge plan about how you're going to take care of, say, a whole hospital or the entire patient population or whatever. What we've seen is organizations that have smaller staffs that are devoted to value or taking care of people at home, or some of these CRM functionalities that we're talking about here, they don't generally focus on every single patient in the ecosystem. They focus, in the case of Mount Sinai, on a disparate Medicaid population, or we see organizations that have pioneering, forward-looking cardiologists, let's say, or even orthopedic surgeons who are focused on their disease state and their sort of smaller circumscribed group. Or maybe we see this focused on the pediatric population, or the pediatric asthma population. Again, even a smaller niche of patients. And what they do is they prove not only the patient experience, which is the satisfaction component, and not only the health outcomes component, but they prove out a cost savings. And if they can find something that improves the health and the patient experience and lowers the cost, they have a pretty good chance of taking that small staff that have been devoted to a single use case or a smaller use case and expanding that and getting the investment, either in the case that you mentioned where you can get people to cross over from one job to another, or sometimes organizations can even successfully lobby for more headcount to pull some of these functions off. Some of the things that we're seeing, I think, point to some very promising changes, that more and more people are being devoted to the kinds of preventive, at-home, and health maintenance functions over the sort of standard high-cost interventions that we've been seeing in the past. And I think the way it's going to happen is by, taking off pieces of the healthcare world that are a little more digestible.
And then one last comment, Josh, and that is that, remember, there's two ways to sell a product. One is it's so cool, everybody wants it. The other is the government forces you to buy it. And so what I think we're seeing is that with the regulatory changes, and I'm not talking about ACA changes, I'm just saying that in general, over the next several years, we'll all be moving from fee-for-service to value-based purchasing. In effect, it becomes kind of a regulatory compliance mandate to embrace these kinds of tools.
Well, in my mind, it can't come fast enough.
And remember, we're both in our 50s, I think. We get to be care navigators for our families. And as soon as you become about 55 like me, you discover managing those above you and managing those below you without tools like this is nearly impossible.
I think that's the biggest hope in all these stories, is that every one of us has an experience with the healthcare system that we could imagine could be improved. Every one of us has the experience of successful organizations outside of healthcare, and we know what to expect and we know what to demand. And I think we're starting to see it. I'm pretty optimistic.
And I, too, share your optimism.
Excellent. Katie?
Perfect. Great conversations. Unfortunately, at this time, we have to wrap up, but thank you all for joining us, and thank you to our speakers, Josh and John, for joining us today, as well as sharing their expertise. We look forward to having you joining us for another webinar in the future. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.